When I was in high school, I had the horrific experience of watching a good friend of mine named David almost completely fail his senior capstone project. My senior year, I took a history elective for my senior project, and the class was a must pass if you wanted to graduate from high school. You had to showcase your history chops, your research acumen, your ability to write and present on a topic in history. And my friend chose to do his research project on the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And during the presentation that he gave, he started to say some outlandish and concerning things. He began to talk about secret notes and phone calls. He began to assert that President Roosevelt was itching to get in the war and looking for an excuse. He shared that Japanese codes had already been broken and that telegrams proved American leaders were tracking the Japanese naval fleet and knew where they were at all times. And to wrap it up in his conclusion, he declared this. He said, "So in conclusion, FDR knew about Pearl Harbor. He allowed the attack to happen so that Americans would get involved in World War II. He has the blood of American patriots on his hands." And that was his conclusion after his senior research project. And this is 2005. This is, some 20 years ago in the early age of the internet. And to be fair, we were all trying to figure out how to best leverage the information superhighway, right? And my friend had discovered this sort of deep internet conspiracy, but it predates the internet. It goes back to 1944 even, which was the idea of the attack on Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory. The idea that the higher level U.S. officials could have stopped the attack, but chose not to give the excuse for America to enter the war. And as far as conspiracy theories go, this one doesn't really hold up all that well to scrutiny, right? It doesn't really bear the burden of proof. I mean, you've got some other conspiracy theories where you may be like, that's kind of interesting. Let me think more about that. But this one's pretty well researched and debunked. But at the time in class, as we're sitting there, the rest of us in the classroom were horrified because our friend was getting up and giving this presentation. And, he had like a month to go. And he had to pass his class. And all of his semester had been put up to this presentation, and things were falling apart for him. Our friend's grades, by proxy his college admission, they were all in jeopardy because we all knew in that moment he had gone down the internet conspiracy rabbit hole. Our reading today in Colossians, it leads with this advice. Paul says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of this world, and not according to Christ." This is a fantastic joke. And I say it's a joke. Paul is making a joke here because where is he writing from? He is writing from a prison cell. We talked about that some last week. Paul, this cheeky guy, writing from a prison cell, who is in fact captive by the actual political power juggernaut of the world, says, "I don't want you to be captive." But he doesn't say he wants him to stay out of jail. He doesn't say he doesn't want handcuffs. He says, "I don't want you to be captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, things that are not according to Christ." Paul says, "I don't care about my literal, physical, political chains. I am concerned about your philosophical, spiritual worldview chains." What a powerful image for Paul to start our reading with today. And I want to talk about the importance today of what Paul is writing about, which is to guard our hearts and our minds from Christian alternatives. And from the very beginning of our series, we've been leaning heavily on this quote that kind of summarizes Paul's greater argument in Colossians. It's a quote from the theologian A.W. Tozer. He says, "The most important thing about you is what you think about when you think about God." And so if what you think about God, right, is sort of an ultimate question that bleeds into every aspect of your life. And so Paul really wants the church in Colossae to fully understand the riches and the grace and the mercy of God. And he also says, but we also need to rid ourselves of the things that are not true about God, the things that are not true about the world. And so to do so in today, Paul is going to target a specific individual worldly idea and say, this is not how God works, and we need to flush it out of our systems so we can understand God better. And we're going to talk about that today. So far in Paul's letter, he's made two correctives. He says, church, your vision of Jesus is too small. He's not just a rabbi who taught good things. Jesus is bigger than you can possibly imagine. He is eternal. He is cosmic. He is God walking amongst us. That is what Paul says about Jesus. And if you want, of course, to get your thoughts about God right, Paul says, think more highly of Jesus. So he says that. He says, I want you to think more highly of Jesus. And he says, I want you to think differently about the problem of suffering. That's the second corrective Paul says. He says, I might be in prison, but this is actually good because my hardships and my suffering actually, they testify to how much I'm actually doing it like Jesus did. Paul says, if you know who Jesus is, like Jesus was crucified and he was died and he was killed and murdered. And he says, but that's the way things go. And so if I'm preaching the gospel and find myself imprisoned by it and handcuffed and under house arrest, he says, that's proof I'm doing it right. So he's got these correctives he's trying to say, but today he says, we need to talk about the elemental spirits of this world. The elemental spirits of this world. He says, because if you believe in sort of the machinations and the way that the world works, if you're so engrossed in that, you're not going to understand Jesus to the fullest. And so what does Paul start our reading off with? He says, don't submit yourselves to these elemental worldly spirits that are against Christ. And then he says, well, let me remind you what Christ is, right? That's the first part of the reading. Paul says this about Jesus. He says, in Jesus, the fullness of deity dwells bodily. He says, Jesus is the head and rule over all authority. He's higher on the org chart than the Sanhedrin and the Jewish leadership. He's higher on the org chart than the emperor himself. And he says Jesus is the biggest and the top of them all. And he says Jesus died and rose again. Who else has done that? Nobody, but we will, because we are in him. We have faith in him. He says that Jesus has made him part of his body through baptism and not circumcision. He says that Jesus has forgiven our trespasses. He's canceled the record of debt against us, i.e. he atoned for our sins. He disarmed the rulers of this world, triumphing over them, and Jesus lives in us through the power of the Holy Spirit. That's a lot. And if you read through there, Paul is very concerned, not necessarily with what we can give to God, but what God has done for us. He says, focus on how Jesus died and rose again. That's pretty good. He accomplished this incredibly cosmically relevant feat. He did that. And now, says Paul, we get caught up in that. That by his grace we are saved and called his people. Our sins are forgiven. Paul says that it's important to remember that this is about what Jesus has done for us. And that's important for what comes next, because Paul then goes on to talk about two categories of bad philosophy. Two categories of bad philosophy. Here is the first category of bad philosophy. He says, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are shadows of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Right? In many churches in this time, in the ancient world, people were mistaken. They thought that new Christians should adopt the law of Moses for their own life. Questions of food and drink, questions about keeping kosher, questions about, like, should we celebrate the Feast of Booths, questions about should we keep the same Sabbath in the same ways. And Paul says, don't worry about it. Don't let people pass judgment about that. That's ancillary to what Christ has accomplished on the cross. You don't need to focus on this. And so he says, that's one category of error. The second category of error looks like this. He says, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by the sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head. So on the one hand, you have people who look to the law of Moses and say, we should still be doing that. And Paul says, nope. And then you have these other folks who are dealing with things like asceticism and the worship of angels. and going on about visions and having these charismatic experiences, and they're puffed up, says Paul. And that language of puffed up, you may recall, for those of you who were part of our Bible study last year, it's heavily used in the church in his letters to Corinth. Paul talks about how this was a puffed up church. And Paul uses this idea of being puffed up to talk about super spiritual, super Christians who are both incredibly ascetic and holy and pious, and they have these ecstatic visions, but they leverage all of that. They leverage their sort of super Christian piousness to judge and condemn other Christians. Right? If the roller coaster says, you must be this tall to ride, the super Christians are saying you must be this kind of spiritual, where clearly you're not getting it. You're not part of the church. You have to sort of have this level of spirituality that we do. And so you have two different types of philosophies that Paul is specifically targeting. And what do they both have in common? Well, they both have to do with regulations. Let me keep reading. If with Christ you have died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you still live in the world, do you submit to regulations? Regulations. That's what Paul is upset about in our reading today. He says these regulations, they have the appearance of wisdom, and in promoting sort of self-made religion, he says they look good because they talk about asceticism and self-flagellation and doing all these things. But he says, what's interesting? He says, you're following these regulations, but these regulations are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. That's how our reading, that's how the paragraph ends in our reading. Paul says that by adding all of these unnecessary regulations to the church, it looks like wisdom, but it's not. Because in actuality, these rules have no value in reining in people's bad behavior. In our reading today, Paul contrasts two different types of religion. Right? He says the first is Christianity, which is sort of cosmic and eternal, and Jesus has accomplished something beyond what the world understands. And Jesus rescues people from dark powers and wicked humanity and hell. Like there's that Christianity where we focus on what Christ has done for us. And then there's this second type of Christianity that's about rules and regulations and doing the right thing. And if you don't do these things, well, your faith is either deficient or non-existent. And Paul says that second type of Christianity, the rules-based Christianity, that's the one that is an elemental spirit of this world. You're thinking, if that's how we view Christianity, he says, no. You're too worldly and you don't think enough about the big cosmic work of Christ. We tend to think that when he talks about these elemental spirits of our world, Paul is probably talking about some ideologies or philosophies, which in some ways he is, right? You look at philosophies like nihilism, utilitarianism, Marxism, Nazism, racial supremacy, authoritarianism, and those things are repugnant to a loving and caring God. And you can think of it as other religions too, right? Like other religions, they may have some kernels of truth in them, but none of them lift up Jesus and acknowledge what he has accomplished on the cross. And so we might even think in our own times, right, about the maxims of our age. We might think about things like techno-utopian commercialism, which says if we just sort of get AI right, all of our problems will be solved. Or, sort of the maximizing profit for shareholders version of capitalism. Or we might look at the individualism of our age, which says that a person can be only concerned with his or her own flourishing. And these are all false worldviews that are anathema to the believing Christian. I think we kind of understand that if Jesus died and rose again, these worldviews just aren't on the table as options for the Christian to believe. And yet, in our reading today, there are other places where you can say Paul is talking about those things. But in our reading today, his description of the empty philosophy, the thing he is concerned that the church is going to be imprisoned by, the thing that he's most concerned about is the idea that we relate to God based on regulations and not based on our redemption. And regulations are great outside the church, right? You need regulations for your work and your school and your driver's license and your building codes. One note that I get to share in a little bit at our cookout in a little bit today is that we got the thumbs up officially from Bethlehem to put up a sign down at the bottom of the hill here on Class A Drive. And so we're working with the sign shop to get it squared away. In a couple of weeks, we should have an Epiphany sign at the bottom of the hill, which is good because in the great rebranding, our sort of name on the big sign down there got taken away. And so it'll be good. People can see that we are here and this is where we worship. But when we in the township, we don't really have to go through any legal hoops to make that happen. But in the borough, when we put up a sign for the church office, maybe you know this, there were regulations. What are the regulations to put up a sign for your business in Ligonier Borough? First, you have to pay $35. And then you have to present a proposal to the sign committee. And the sign committee, they review the size, they review its placement near the road, they review the language and the imagery on the sign to make sure it's good. And only after you get it approved and only after you pay the fee do you get to put up your sign here in town. Regulations, certain size requirements. How big is it? How close to the road and the sidewalk is it? Those are all regulations, and they are fine regulations because they keep the town looking nice and they keep the sidewalks from being cluttered. And someone just can't go and put up a sign. There are regulations against that, and that's fine. That's what regulations are supposed to do. A well-ordered society needs regulations. But what does a Christianity look like when it becomes defined by regulation? What does a Christianity look like when it becomes regulated? I'll tell you what happens. You get a burnt-over district. Anybody heard that phrase before, a burnt-over district? Anybody know what I'm talking about from 10th grade history class? No? Let me tell you what a burnt-over district is. In the 1830s, Charles Grandison Finney was a great sort of revivalist preacher in the United States. And a lot of where Finney focused was in the American Northeast. So think New England, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that region is where Finney spent most of his time. And he was a big revivalist preacher. And he would go to these revivals and there would be the hot seat and they create very emotional moments and people would respond emotively to these revivals. And Grandison Finney was not the only one doing it. This was a time in America they call the Second Great Awakening, and revivals were everywhere, right? Big tent revivals. And so you had at the time, Finney and people like him with a massive revival ministry where they would go town to town, city to city. They'd have these highly emotive worship experiences, and then when they were done, they would move on to the next one, and people would make commitments in those meetings and then theoretically get plugged in with their churches. But that's not the only movement that was going on, because you also, at the same time, had the sort of development of Mormonism, right? The Latter-day Saints are developing at this time, and the Seventh-day Adventists are developing at this time, and there were social movements as well. It was the era of Seneca Falls and the women's rights movement. It was abolition was swinging into high gear, so the anti-slavery movement was in high gear. This was a time when prohibitionism, right? We're going to ban alcohol, and vegetarianism, right? We're just going to eat vegetables because it's better for our health. These were ideas that all flourished at the same time in America. And so you had this great enthusiasm. And on top of all this, you had utopian experiments too. People who tried to start communes and start these little sort of perfect societies. A famous one was the Oneida community in New York. And each of these religions and worldviews and cults and apocalyptic fervor revival preaching groups, they were all accompanied by regulations. To be a Christian, you had to stop drinking. To be a Christian, you had to sign up for the abolition movement. Finney himself was famous because he'd have a revival. And after the revival, he said, great, you've committed your life to Christ. If you're going to be baptized, you have to sign this anti-slavery petition. He made it a component of people being baptized that they had to write up against slavery. And then the Adventists were like, well, to be a Christian, you have to worship on Saturday and not Sunday. And to be a Christian, you have to join our utopian compound because we're doing it right and everybody else is doing it wrong. Regulations, rules, social change, be better, do better. This world is terrible, and if you just reform how you behave, then things will be better. That was the spirit of the age. But a funny thing happened in about 1850. Starting in the 1850s, Charles Finney noticed that large swaths of the state of New York, central New York and western New York, they had become somewhat inoculated to any revivalist preaching or social campaigns. He would show up in these regions to throw a revival, and nobody would come. And he began to realize that these cities and communities and counties had been overwhelmed by these movements. They had the revivalists and the activists and the utopians, and all of them had come through over the years. And every time they'd come through, there'd be a big revival, and people would get really into it and excited and cheerful. And then things would just calm down and go back to normal after things left. And all the new rules, right? Don't eat meat, right? Don't drink, sign this petition, vote for this candidate. Well, it didn't really make that much of a change in their community. The promises of sort of great social change weren't manifesting. And so people got bitter, people got jaded, people gave up. They just stopped caring because they had been so moved over the past decade by these social movements that they were like, listen, this is just another season of enthusiasm and fervor, and we're just kind of done with it all. We've tried it, we've done this sort of stuff, and we're over it. And Finney described it. He said it's as if a wildfire had swept through the region and consumed everything, and now there's nothing left to burn. And he called these regions burnt over districts, and he started to avoid them on his revival ministry. St. Paul might have said this. He might have said that these movements indeed had the appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, and that's exactly what they all advocated for. But the problem is they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. He said these movements, Paul might say these movements, they looked wise, but they didn't accomplish what they set out to achieve. In fact, they inspired in these regions their opposite. People stopped caring about church and social change because they'd been browbeaten with regulations and rules that obscured true Christianity. It didn't yield the results that it had promised. The causes may have been just and right and true, but as soon as they were turned into barometers for goodness and faith, people checked out. They stopped caring. I wonder if you've ever felt, maybe today you even feel, like a burnt over district. I wonder if you feel that way. Maybe you've become jaded and cynical about the Christian faith. And if it's not you, maybe there's someone you know. Maybe you know someone who kind of is a walking personification of this burnt out district. Just from being in town and talking to people, I know of scores of people who they used to go to church. They used to be involved in maybe a youth group ministry. They used to be involved in Bible studies and potlucks. And they got burnt out by the rules. They got burnt out by rules about how to dress, what to listen to and watch on TV, what politics to support. They got burnt out on the rules. And now they're burnt over and they're not interested in church. And this is why Paul wants us to reflect so heavily on the eternal cosmic Christ and his sacrifice on the cross. When the world says that everything is about regulation and earning your belonging, in the Christian gospel we find actually it's all about grace. It's all about mercy. It's not about checklists or measuring up. It's not about perfection. It's not about living up to expectations or passing a minimum score on the test. Grace is the Christian belief that Jesus has accomplished it all on our behalf. What does he demand of us? Acknowledgement of that accomplishment and appreciation in praise and worship. And that's the bulk of it. What a word from St. Paul, friends, in our reading today. He gives us permission to blot out the noise of those who demand regulations. And he says, you don't have to play those games. Let no one pass judgment on you. Let no one disqualify you. See to it, says Paul, that you don't fall for the elemental spirits of this world, that regulation will somehow save you or make you worthy before God. That was what we were worried about when my friend David had bombed his project, that he wouldn't measure up. We were worried that despite him being very clearly an intelligent man of good character, getting ready to go to college, that we had thought that this mistake that he had made had blown it all. And that the regulations of graduation and academics would condemn him and the rest of his life would be off track as a result. That's what we had thought when he gave his presentation about a conspiracy theory. But when my classmate made this bold pronunciation about FDR, that he allowed Pearl Harbor to happen and that FDR has the blood of American patriots on its hands, our teacher stood up from his seat, gently held up his hand, and smiled gently. He said, "Whoa, David, it seems as if you found some unhelpful websites on the internet that have influenced your research. I know this because, well, you can't find that kind of information in a library." He said, "Let's talk after class and let's see if we can't sort this out." And I don't know exactly what happened after that. Maybe it was remedial work. Maybe he rewrote his paper. Maybe he got a stern talking to from his teacher. I don't know. But David did not flunk his capstone, even if, by the regulations, he deserved it. By his teacher's grace and goodwill, he was in fact allowed to pass the course. In fact, my friend went on to graduate from the Air Force Academy. He went to Combat Diver School, one of the military's most elite training facilities, for doing all of the things you need to do to be a soldier, but do them underwater with scuba equipment on. He went on to join a U.S. Special Forces unit that go on the kind of missions that literally, if he told me what he did, he'd actually have to kill me, right? We joke about that, but that's what he did. And it's such a beautiful thing to see, because if he had been crushed by the regulations of that project, none of that would have happened. And not only would his life have been off track, but the country would have been deprived of a faithful service member who gave his body and his life to the service of country and went to the top echelons of service to do what needed to be done to protect the freedoms of America, right? And this is why we live by love and not by law, because the regulations, as good and as helpful as they are, they're not foolproof. Just because we have a regulation doesn't mean it's right or good or true. And this is why, again, we live by love and not by law. And so, friends, don't bet on the rules and regulations to save you. It's all grace from beginning to end. It is Jesus who has triumphed over the rulers and authorities of this world, disarming them and defeating death, not us. And by God's grace, we're caught up in that victory. The gift is there for the taking. Why would you try to earn something that someone else bought for you? The legal accusations against you have been canceled. Why bother trying to relitigate them? Friends, it's never been about the regulations. It's been about resurrection. And that is a promise made to us apart from our achievement. In Jesus' name, amen.